I want to begin by acknowledging and paying tribute to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. We're gathered here this evening to hear from recently retired, you wanted to emphasize that point, Canadian press reporter Bob Weber. Now, looking out into the room, it's pretty clear to me that for many of us, Bob needs no introduction. Bob has been Alberta's eyes and ears and voice when it comes to the environment for close to 3 decades. But he's been more than that too. As a good friend and collaborator of mine and president of the Wilderness Conservation Society of Canada put it in her own post advertising this talk, Bob has been a defining voice in Canadian environmental journalism, covering environmental politics and natural resource development in the North with depth and clarity, and whose recent retirement leaves a noticeable gap in day-to-day reporting. And thanks to the help of my research assistant, Rob McLeod, I can tell you something about that gap, which is in fact more like a chasm. If you search the Canadian Press Archives at the University of Calgary Library for articles written by Bob Weber, you'll find at least 3,155 of them. And between 1997 and 2024, and I'm reliably informed by Colette Derowitz that that is likely an underestimate. In the last 13 years, Bob averaged 131 stories per year, or just over 1 story every 3 days, year-round, if we were going to go that way. Recurring themes include coal mining on the eastern slopes, species at risk, including caribou, polar bears, grizzly bear, climate change science, impacts, policy, and controversy, oil sands development and associated environmental impacts, court cases involving environmental issues, northern issues, including involving the Inuit, and recurring theme, maybe Bob will tell us more about, dinosaurs. Like so many of Canada's coolest kids, Bob is also from Saskatchewan. His first vocation was actually music, playing and teaching the trumpet professionally for some time before deciding that he wanted to write for a living, at which point he attended Carleton University's journalism program. He then got a gig at the Red Deer Advocate, where he worked for 7 years and did pretty much everything you can do at a newspaper except actually delivering them. And then in 1994, he joined the Canadian Press in Edmonton, where he covered courts, arts, politics, whatever came up, including 3 months in Afghanistan during the conflict there. In the late 1990s, he married Sylvia Stroyek, who he describes as a legendary CP editor and now also a freelancer. And it was around that time that he also began writing environmental stories when the oil sands started to boom. And so that seems as good a place as any to hand it over to Bob.
Start with some thanks. Is this picking me up, Mark? I'm so tall. Okay, here we go. Some thanks. First of all, thanks to all of you for joining us tonight, and including the folks on Zoom. Thanks to Martin for that kind introduction. And I would also like to say at this point, I'm here at the University of Calgary at Martin's invitation. And over the years, the researchers and faculty at this institution have been go-to sources for me. And those thousands of articles that Martin referred to, many of them wouldn't have been possible without the work of people here. So while I'm in your kitchen here, I'd like to say thanks. So I will get on with it here. On May 15th, 2020, the government of Alberta issued a document called Information Letter 2020-23. It was entitled Rescission of a Coal Development Policy for Alberta. Note the careful bureaucratic obscurity of the title. Before I read that, I didn't even know rescission was a word. Note also the date, the Friday before the May long weekend. There's this theory in government that possibly troublesome releases stand a better chance of being overlooked if they're put out late on a Friday afternoon when reporters are gearing down for the weekend. It's called around the legislature taking out the trash. Sometimes it even works. This particular piece of trash was 1 page long. It was accompanied by no backgrounders, no analysis, no explanation. Then Energy Minister Sonia Savage appeared at no advanced press conferences to explain it. No technical briefings were held, nor was it debated in the legislature. Nevertheless, it threw out 44 years of precedent and opened vast areas of the Rockies and surrounding foothills to open pit coal. The most profound change in land use policy Alberta had seen in more than a decade was simply slipped onto a government website. A few days later, I got a panicked phone call from a member of an environmental group that I was in common touch with. Was I aware that the United Conservatives had just opened up one of Alberta's most beloved landscapes to coal mining? I was not. It seemed newsworthy, and I started writing about it. Others joined in, and you all know what happened next. Probably the greatest environmental backlash this province has ever seen eventually forced the government to back down, at least for a little while. But let's compare the rollout of the coal policy rescission with another major Alberta land use plan, the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. That plan governs energy development, water use, farming, ranching, recreation, forest management, and nature-based tourism over a huge swath of southern Alberta. It was released in 2014 after 5 years of study. Thousands of Albertans made themselves heard during three rounds of public consultation. The legally binding plan remains in place and is relied on for guidance for everyone from municipalities to NGOs. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the distance we've traveled. We once made policy using the classic conservative virtues of careful thought and consultation. We now have top-down fiats delivered from on high. Now, you are not about to listen to a research paper tonight. I'm going to speak from personal memory and from experience as someone who has traveled this distance I speak of. The journey has led me to a few conclusions. What I've seen is that at a time of environmental crisis, when cities are literally burning and major watersheds drying up, our governments are denying us the conversations we need to have. They're drawing the blinds on our windows into policy. They're closing the shutters on our view into decision-making, and they're bricking up our doorways to understanding. I came to the Edmonton Bureau of the Canadian Press in 1994 and worked there until I retired last September. I arrived back in the days of Ralph Klein. Y'all remember Ralph Klein, right? Or at least many of you do. I didn't agree with a lot of what his government did, but I will say this for Ralph. When the legislature was in session, Ralph would show up regularly in the press gallery media theater at 1:30 and he'd take questions. And not just a few, because there was a lot more of us back then. Ralph would stand there and field everything we threw at him. We'd shout out questions from the floor and he'd take them on. Some of those press conferences went on for more than an hour. It got to be a little bit of a press gallery joke, keep Ralph talking and eventually he'll say something newsworthy. Nor was Ralph the only open access politician back then. Ministers were buttonholed daily for freewheeling scrums. Often, they granted one-on-one interviews, in person or on the phone. And after the hurly-burly of a big day, a throne speech or a budget, reporters and politicians would gather at a bar across 109th Street from the Ledge for beers. Those were the days. Compare that to a Danielle Smith presser. Firstly, they're rare. Smith prefers to address Albertans through social media or her radio show. Secondly, they're short. In my experience, rarely more than 20 minutes or so. Many times I was still in the question queue when the time was up and things wrapped up and I didn't get a chance to ask anything. Thirdly, they're highly managed. Government communication staff choose the questioners, putting control in their hands. Chosen reporters are then limited to 2 questions each. Now, if a politician can't bat aside 2 questions with message track responses, they're in the wrong job. Almost all UCP press conferences follow this pattern. So do those of many other politicians, liberal, conservative, federal, provincial. They all do it that way now because it works, keeps things under control. Now, if that was my only complaint, I wouldn't be speaking with you here today. No doubt some form of order needed to be imposed on us unruly reporters, especially as more and more of us dial in as opposed to actually showing up at a press conference. Press conferences have always been part theater and are not a reporter's most important source of information. But the noose on access has been pulled much tighter than that. Part of a reporter's job is to collect as many different sides to a story as can be crammed into the copy. 600-700 words. It was routine for me, after I'd listened to someone's concerns or read some new research, to go to the government for its side. Back in the day, I could usually get someone on the phone who understood and could actually explain the government policy in question. Sometimes I could get the minister. Even press secretaries would answer a verbal back and forth with on-the-record responses. By the end of my career, explanation and response had deteriorated into comment. If I wanted comment, I had to email a question or two to the requisite press sec and wait for a response. It normally came right on my deadline, generally 3 or 4 sentences of motherhood statements that a colleague of mine used to refer to as banana mumble chicken. There was little chance for follow-ups or clarification. Take what you get, be grateful for it. Often, the responses didn't even address the questions I'd raised and were simply partisan jabs. Government good, opponents bad. It was often a challenge to find something that was actually usable for the story. Now, again, this is not unique to Alberta. It started with Stephen Harper and his administration in Ottawa, and they all do it now. But Alberta seems uniquely enthusiastic about emailed comment. For example, the head of communications at the Alberta Energy Regulator once told me bluntly that the institution's policy is that all communications are conducted through email. Nobody's allowed to talk to anybody under any circumstances, lest they say something. Cabinet ministers, forget about it. Over my career, I interviewed repeatedly every single environment minister in this province from Ralph Klein onward. Some of them I was on pretty good terms with. The United Conservatives have had 2 environment ministers, Jason Nixon and Rebecca Schultz. I once got 5 minutes on the phone with Nixon. Despite dozens of requests, Rebecca Schultz never spoke with me, not once. Nor is the clampdown limited to politicians and political staff. I used to be on a first-name basis with some of the Alberta government's top scientists, and believe me, we've had some really good people working for us. If I needed information on, say, caribou populations or chronic wasting disease in deer, I could go right to the source, right away. By the time I left the Canadian press, it took elaborate, secretive machinations on the level of a spy novel to talk to actual scientists. And I am not exaggerating. I'm talking about like secret email addresses and third-party go-betweens, you know. One researcher refused to speak to me at all about a published paper, a publicly published paper he had co-authored as a government employee for fear of repercussions from Alberta, even though he no longer worked for the government and in fact lived in the US. And there's FOIP. It's supposed to stand for freedom of information, but it may have been better summed up by a Klein era cabinet minister as fuck off, it's private. FOIP searches sorry. FOIP searches used to be extremely useful to me. I got all kinds of stuff, draft reports on sour gas releases before the bureaucrats had time to water them down. Some of my first oil sand stories back in the late 90s were based on internal environmental impact studies that I got through FOIP. Now, I understand that not everything can be released and not everything should be released. But over the years, the redactions just kept getting bigger and bigger. I think peak redaction was achieved the day I got a FOIP response consisting of 300 completely blank pages. Yes, I did write a story about it, but it was not the story I wanted. There are still reporters doing excellent FOIP work, God love them, but it's getting harder. The Globe and Mail has declared Alberta the most secretive jurisdiction in a secretive country, and recently that got worse. The UCP has introduced legislation that would extend exemptions from the law to political staff, keeping more people nice and warm under a cozy blanket of secrecy. Now, the flip side of ignoring troublesome questions is cherry-picking who you listen to. This also happens. Look at the recent study on reforms to the Alberta Energy Regulator, written by a pair of longtime insiders with no input from civil society. Look at who has standing before the regulator's hearings. Unless you are literally next door to a project, you have no voice. Look at the Siksika First Nation, forced into court over broken government consultation promises. And if I may leave purely environmental concerns for a moment, consider the government's recent report into its COVID response, headed by a former UCP candidate and dismissed by medical professionals as misinformation at best. Now, maybe you're saying, so what? Governments are elected to govern, and that means making choices that not everybody's going to be happy about. Majority rules, and if you're not happy about it, better luck next election. I would suggest that's a grade school understanding of democracy. Governments are entitled to act on their agendas, but they are not entitled to pretend that those who don't agree don't exist. Mature administrations try to find some compromise to bring everyone along and govern for everyone. It's the difference between parliamentary democracy and an elected monarchy. I would further argue that broad discussion among an informed public is particularly crucial in environmental issues. Decisions about the health of a river or a forest, the integrity of a landscape, or the abundance of wildlife last for generations. A law on tax policy can be changed after the next election if it doesn't work out. A law that allows the removal of a mountaintop alters Alberta forever. As well, you may have noticed that the world is changing. Climate change will eventually force a worldwide shift from high carbon energy, the kind of energy our province produces. We will not have a choice in this. It will happen, for the alternative does not bear thinking about. We all know the extent to which our province depends on oil and gas, but for the first time, we can see that the industry that has powered our province for so long is vulnerable. We desperately need to have honest conversations about where we're going, how long it will take to get there, and what this place will look like when we arrive. Instead, it's an information-free zone. Instead, we get ethical oil, as if the jet stream or the oceans cared about our human rights legislation. Instead, we get bromides about world-class regulatory systems, as if unreclaimed wells and tailings ponds don't dot our landscape. Instead, we get what happened to Alberta's renewable industry. Some said the developments would take too much farmland or that wind turbines would be too hard to reclaim. Those objections were all pretty much refuted, some by researchers at this school. But reality-based information doesn't matter, or didn't matter. The decisions were made behind closed doors on the advice of nobody knows whom. The most promising parts of the province are now shut off to the industry, and money is fleeing elsewhere. Finally, I would argue that environmental decisions reveal important things about Albertans as a people. Choosing what to exploit and what to preserve shows what we value and who we care about. This land is our home. And like a home long lived in, how it looks reflects its residents. When we allow one more bit of caribou habitat to wink out, or one more trout stream in the foothills to silt up, we lessen ourselves. And we lessen all the generations that come after. I'm going to argue that what we do to our home, our province, we do to ourselves. Surely we should all be around the table to talk about that. Again, I'd like to emphasize, this is my experience. I'm sure there are reporters out there who feel very differently, and I'm not arguing with them. I'm just telling you what it's been like for me. And this is what I've seen in 25 or 30 years of the environment beat in Alberta. Fewer chances for public input, fewer answers from government, a gradual restriction of public space while decision-making concentrates in fewer and fewer hands. So where does this leave us? Fortunately, with a number of bright spots. While our country's largest newspaper chain, Post Media, is nowhere to be seen on this issue, good environmental journalism is being done by many mainstream organizations. And independent media that take environmental issues seriously are a rising force. I'm thinking of the National Observer, and the Tyee, Hakai magazine, and of course, the Narwhal, which is astonishingly only 7 years old and is already changing the national conversation. Another hopeful sign is what I call the democratization of data. Our governments may be increasingly closed-mouthed, but in a way that matters less and less. As I speak, dozens of satellites orbit overhead, monitoring a whole range of environmental benchmarks from greenhouse gas emissions to forest clear cutting. And they're doing it in real time at a level of detail that boggles the mind. 10 years ago, data like this was precious and rare. Now it's a commercial product you can just go out and buy, or you can get it from public sources like the European Space Agency or NASA. Environmental groups have become expert at using this data to ground truth government claims. They use geomatics with impressive speed and accuracy. I remember during the initial controversy about Alberta's coal policy, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society made maps of all the coal exploration leases that were much more comprehensive and much more useful than anything the government put out. Similarly, the late lamented Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project carefully documented the size and extent of the lingering impacts of the energy industry, a great service to us all. And of course, scientists themselves are becoming increasingly outspoken about the consequences of the path that we're on. So despite government attempts to direct the environmental conversation, they are increasingly unable to, and that's all to the good. Still, environmental journalism is always going to be a tough road to hoe. Nobody likes the environmental reporter. In good times, you're a buzzkill. In bad times, you're a job killer. You're always kind of a scolding. And it ain't glamorous. You're not out there at hip waders in the swamp with the intrepid field biologist. No, you're back in the newsroom. You're going through court judgments and regulatory documents, because that's where we really decide who gets to do what to whom. You're adding up and you're staring at long columns of figures until a pattern emerges or until your eyes cross, which comes first. And it takes resources to do this, the chief among them, time. In a newsroom, time is the most precious commodity of all. And as journalism resources shrink, there's less and less of that precious commodity around for everyone. It takes a personal toll as well. There aren't too many good news stories on this beat, and you always seem to be writing about loss. That weighs on you after a while. I know it weighed on me. But that's the world we live in. What we make of it is up to us, reporters and members of an engaged public. And before I close, I'd like to remind you of what can still be made. I'd like to return to the event with which I started this talk, the coal policy decision. It didn't take long for news of the government's plan to spread. I and my colleagues got the information out as soon as we could, and I've never seen anything like what happened next. It was clear that Albertans felt a sacred trust had been breached and that their sense of themselves, who they were and where they lived, had been attacked. Within days, ranchers, big city nature lovers, small town mayors, scientists, country music stars, they all banded together and forced the United Conservatives to backtrack. We demanded and got a seat at the table and a forum for our voices. We demanded and got policy that protected what we loved and what we wanted for our children. It was maybe the most inspiring story I ever covered and made me realize how much, despite everything, I love this place. Now, you may say the coal threat is back. Yes, it is. And that shouldn't surprise us. As the writer Jane Rule says, politics is like housework. Just because you swept the dirt out last week doesn't mean it doesn't need doing again. The point is, it can be done. It can be done when the facts are on the table, and it can be done when people are heard. It can be done, and it must be done. It's hard and disheartening. It never seems to end, I know. But in the words of that great country singer and philosopher, Lyle Lovett, What would you be if you didn't even try? Thanks very much.